The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of O'Hare International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floor as a man in his early 40s walked through the bustling terminal. He was dressed comfortably in well-worn jeans and a simple black t-shirt, pulling a sleek carry-on suitcase that had seen its fair share of travels. Nothing about his appearance suggested that he was anything more than an ordinary traveler, except perhaps the quiet confidence in his stride. As he approached the business-class check-in counter, he couldn't help but notice how the other passengers in line were dressed in their sharp business suits and designer clothes. He'd been in the aviation industry long enough to know that appearance shouldn't matter, but 20 years of experience had taught him otherwise. The acquisition papers for Summit Airways were safely stored in his briefcase, papers that proved he now owned 51% of the airline shares. The official announcement wasn't scheduled until the following week, and he'd decided to take this flight to personally observe the airline's service quality. The terminal was getting busier by the minute. A group of teenagers on a school trip filled the air with excited chatter, while busy executives rushed past, phones pressed to their ears. He smiled, remembering his own journey that started in flight school. Back then, owning an airline had seemed like an impossible dream for someone from his background. He'd worked his way up from being a baggage handler to a flight operations manager, saving every penny and learning every aspect of the airline business. As he finally reached the front of the line, he noticed the immediate change in the check-in staff's demeanor. Two employees behind the counter exchanged pointed looks, the kind he'd seen countless times before. One of them, wearing a supervisor's badge, whispered something to her colleague, failing to be as discreet as she probably thought she was. Their eyes darted between his casual clothes and the business class ticket he'd just handed over. The supervisor's perfectly manicured fingers tapped slowly on the keyboard, her forced smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir, but we seem to be having some system issues with your booking." Her tone was dripping with fake politeness, the kind reserved for people they believed didn't belong. He remained calm, having faced similar situations throughout his career. The other check-in counter was processing business-class passengers smoothly, executives in expensive suits passing through without a second glance. A woman in designer heels breezed through while the staff were still verifying his ticket. The air grew thick with tension as more passengers lined up behind him. He could hear their impatient sighs and shuffling feet. The supervisor made a show of picking up her phone, presumably to verify his booking, while her colleague continued to give him looks that suggested he'd somehow wandered into the wrong line. Standing there, he thought about all the times he'd been underestimated, all the doors that had initially been closed in his face. Each of those moments had only fueled his determination to succeed, to create change from within the industry. Now, as the owner of this very airline, he had the power to ensure no other passenger would face such treatment. Little did these employees know that the system issue they claimed to be having would soon become a pivotal moment, not just for them, but for the entire airline industry. As he patiently waited, he was already mentally drafting the changes he would implement to transform Summit Airways into an example of inclusive excellence in air travel. The next few minutes would change everything, but for now, he simply stood there, a picture of composure, letting the scene unfold. After all, sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected teachers, and he was about to deliver a masterclass in dignity and leadership. The morning rush at the airport was in full swing as more passengers gathered behind the business class counter. The two staff members were now openly whispering to each other, barely trying to hide their prejudiced assumptions. "I've never seen someone like him in business class before," one muttered to the other, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The businessman stood quietly, watching as they made a show of checking and rechecking his ticket. He thought back to his journey. From cleaning aircraft cabins to studying aviation management at night school, working double shifts to save money for his business degree. Every step had been a lesson in patience and determination. "Sir," the supervisor said, her voice syrupy sweet but her eyes cold, "we just need to follow proper procedures. You understand, don't you?" She emphasized the word procedures as if it were a weapon. Meanwhile, other business class passengers breezed through the adjacent counter without any extra procedures. A young boy standing in line with his father pointed at the scene. "Dad, why are they checking his ticket so many times?" The father quickly shushed his son, looking uncomfortable as he witnessed the obvious discrimination unfolding before them. Other passengers shifted uneasily, some averting their eyes while others watched with growing concern. The supervisor picked up her phone again, pretending to make another verification call. "Yes, I have a situation here," she said into the receiver, eyeing the businessman's simple black t-shirt and jeans with obvious disapproval. Her colleague continued to tap away at her keyboard, making unnecessary notes about this suspicious booking. The businessman remained calm, though his fingers drummed lightly on his briefcase, the same briefcase containing documents proving his ownership of the entire airline. He'd faced moments like these throughout his career, each one strengthening his resolve to change things from within the industry. In the background, airport announcements echoed through the terminal, mixing with the general buzz of travelers. A group of flight attendants walked past, their perfectly pressed uniforms and polished shoes contrasting with what the staff clearly considered his inappropriate appearance for business class. Perhaps, the second staff member suggested with fake concern, "We could help you find a more suitable seat in economy. We want all our passengers to feel comfortable." Her emphasis on the word comfortable carried clear implications about where she thought he belonged. Just then, a well-dressed woman approached from the first-class counter. She was a board member who had worked closely with him during the airline's acquisition. She paused, taking in the scene with growing disbelief. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a subtle shake of his head. He wanted to handle this situation his own way. The supervisor was now making a show of examining his ID under the counter light. "We just want to ensure everything is in order," she said, her tone suggesting that nothing about this situation could possibly be in order. Behind him, the line had grown longer, with some passengers checking their watches impatiently, while others observed with clear disapproval at the staff's behavior. Through the large terminal windows, planes took off and landed, their movements a reminder of why he'd fallen in love with aviation in the first place. Each aircraft represented not just a journey through the skies, but the possibility of breaking through barriers, both literal and social. The regional manager's office wasn't far from the check-in counter, and soon enough, this small drama would reach its turning point. For now, though, the businessman simply waited, knowing that sometimes the best lessons come from allowing people to reveal their true colors. In just a few moments, everything would change, but this scene needed to play out, not just for these two staff members, but for everyone watching. The tension at the business class counter had reached a boiling point. The supervisor was now openly suggesting that there must be some mistake with the booking system. "You see," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern, "sometimes our system makes errors, and tickets get misclassified." She stressed the last word while giving her colleague another knowing look. A couple of first-class passengers had stopped to watch the scene unfold, their designer luggage forgotten at their feet. The businessman noticed their stares but kept his composure, remembering all the times he'd been underestimated throughout his career. He thought about his first job as a baggage handler, how the other workers had laughed when he talked about his dreams of running an airline someday. "I've been flying business class for years," he said quietly, his calm voice carrying across the now silent counter area. "Perhaps you could explain exactly what sort of error you think has occurred." The question hung in the air like a challenge, making both staff members shift uncomfortably. The woman from the board, still watching from a distance, had pulled out her phone. She seemed to be texting someone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. The businessman caught her eye again and gave another subtle head shake. He wanted to see how far this would go. "Well," the second staff member jumped in, adjusting her name badge nervously. "We have certain protocols for our premium cabins. It's our responsibility to ensure that all passengers are properly sorted." Her choice of words made several people in line wince visibly. A young flight attendant walking past slowed down, her face showing clear disapproval at her colleague's behavior. She looked like she wanted to say something but continued walking after a moment's hesitation. The businessman made a mental note. There were good people in this airline, people who recognized wrong when they saw it. The supervisor was now making her third unnecessary phone call. "Yes, we have a situation here with a business class ticket that needs verification," she said loudly into the phone, emphasizing each word as if performing for an audience. "No, the passenger doesn't seem to understand our concerns." An elderly gentleman in line couldn't stay quiet any longer. "What exactly are your concerns?" he called out, his voice sharp with disapproval. "The man has a valid ticket. I've been watching for 15 minutes, and you haven't treated anyone else this way." The supervisor's face flushed red, but she pressed on. "Sir, please wait your turn. We're handling a sensitive situation here." She turned back to the businessman. "Now, as I was saying, we could easily rebook you in economy class. I'm sure you'll find it more suitable." Through the terminal windows, another Summit Airways plane was taking off, its engines roaring with power as it lifted into the sky. The businessman watched it for a moment, thinking about how that same power to rise above would soon be demonstrated right here at this counter. The board member had finished her texting and was now speaking quietly into her phone, her eyes never leaving the scene at the counter. The businessman could guess who she was calling. The regional manager's office was just down the terminal. "I'll wait," he said simply, his quiet dignity making the staff member's behavior seem even more outrageous in contrast. A few passengers had their phones out now, some openly recording the situation. In the age of social media, moments like these rarely stayed private for long. The clicking of formal shoes against the airport's polished floor began to echo through the terminal. The sound of someone walking quickly, purposefully. The regional manager was about to arrive, and with him would come a revelation that would change everything. But for now, the businessman stood patient and composed, a silent lesson in grace under pressure for everyone watching. The sound of hurried footsteps grew louder as the regional manager approached the check-in counter. He was a tall man in his 50s, wearing a perfectly pressed suit with the airline's pin on his lapel. His usual confident stride faltered as he caught sight of the businessman standing at the counter. The color drained from his face so quickly that several onlookers noticed. "Good morning, sir," the regional manager said, his voice cracking slightly. He remembered the acquisition meetings all too well, sitting across the conference table from this same man who had been dressed in an expensive suit then. The manager had been one of the few people involved in the confidential sale of the airline. The supervisor, still holding her phone, looked confused at her boss's suddenly nervous behavior. "Sir, we were just handling the situation here with this passenger's ticket," she explained, her previous confidence wavering as she noticed the manager's unusual demeanor. "A situation." The businessman finally spoke up, his voice carrying just enough authority to make everyone listen. "Yes, I'd very much like to hear about this situation." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, with more phones recording the scene. The regional manager's forehead was now shining with sweat. I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he stammered, looking frantically between his staff members and the businessman. The supervisor and her colleague exchanged worried glances, sensing that something was very wrong. A child in the crowd pulled on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why does that man look so scared?" The innocent question carried clearly across the now quiet check-in area, making several people chuckle nervously. The businessman reached into his briefcase, causing both staff members to lean forward curiously. The board member who had been watching stepped closer, a small smile playing on her lips. She knew what was coming. "Perhaps," the businessman said calmly, "we should discuss your airline's check-in procedures." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Or rather, my airline's procedures." The supervisor's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then horrified realization. Her colleague had frozen in place, hands hovering over the keyboard. "You see," the businessman continued, his voice clear but not unkind. "I was hoping to experience our airline service as a regular passenger today. I wanted to see how we treat people, all people." He emphasized the last two words gently. The regional manager stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to the new owner of Summit Airways." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The supervisor's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the counter. Her colleague sank into her chair, looking like she wanted to disappear. The elderly gentleman who had spoken up earlier let out a hearty laugh. "Well, isn't that something?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like someone judged this book by its cover and got the story completely wrong." The businessman pulled out the acquisition papers, setting them gently on the counter. "Now," he said, looking at the two staff members who had treated him so poorly, "let's talk about the future of customer service at Summit Airways." Through the terminal windows, another plane was taking off, its powerful engines lifting it into the bright morning sky. Just like that plane, this moment was about to soar in an unexpected direction, one that would change not just a few employees' perspectives, but the entire airline's approach to customer service. The check-in area had fallen into a stunned silence. The supervisor's face had turned from pale white to deep red, while her colleagues seemed to be finding the computer screen suddenly fascinating. The regional manager dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief, looking like he might need to sit down. "I think," the businessman said softly, "this is a good time to have an honest conversation about customer service." His voice was calm, but it carried an authority that made everyone lean in slightly. Even the passengers who had been impatiently checking their watches were now fully invested in the scene. The board member who had been watching stepped forward, unable to contain her smile any longer. "Should I call an emergency staff meeting?" she asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. The supervisor's eyes widened even further at the realization that she had been performing her discrimination in front of not one, but two high-ranking airline officials. "That won't be necessary," the businessman replied, surprising everyone. "I believe the best lessons are taught in the moment." He turned to address the gathered crowd. "What happened here today isn't just about me. It's about every passenger who's ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character." A young woman in the crowd nodded vigorously, clutching her backpack. "This happened to me last month," she called out. "They made me feel like I didn't belong in first class just because I was wearing hiking clothes after a camping trip." The businessman gestured toward her. "Exactly. And that's going to change, starting today." He turned back to the staff members, whose discomfort was now visible to everyone. "I'm not going to fire you," he said, causing both women to look up in surprise. "That would be too easy, and it wouldn't solve the real problem." The supervisor found her voice, though it trembled slightly. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Her colleague nodded frantically beside her, still unable to speak. "Then don't say anything. Just listen," the businessman replied. He picked up the papers from the counter and held them up. "These documents make me the owner of Summit Airways, but they don't make me any more deserving of respect than I was 10 minutes ago or 20 years ago when I was handling baggage on the tarmac." Through the terminal windows, the morning sun had risen higher, casting long rays across the scene. Another plane took off in the distance, its jet engines roaring with power. The sound seemed to emphasize the weight of the moment. "Starting tomorrow," he continued, "you'll both be part of a new training program. You won't just participate in it. You'll help design it. Because who better to teach others about the impact of prejudice than someone who has faced their own biases head-on?" The elderly gentleman who had spoken up earlier applauded, and soon others joined in. The young flight attendant who had witnessed the earlier discrimination wiped a tear from her eye, her smile bright and hopeful. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve again. "Dad, is this like in my school when they teach us to be nice to everyone?" The father nodded. "Yes, son, exactly like that. Sometimes the best teachers are our own mistakes." The businessman finally handed his ticket back to the supervisor. "Now," he said with a gentle smile, Would you like to check me in for my flight? I believe there are quite a few people waiting in line, and we've kept them long enough." The supervisor's hands shook as she took the ticket, but as she began the check-in process properly this time, something in her expression had changed. It wasn't just shame or embarrassment. There was understanding there too, and maybe even a spark of gratitude for being given a chance to make things right. As the businessman's boarding pass printed out, phones throughout the terminal were buzzing with notifications. Someone had already posted a video of the incident online, and it was spreading fast. The regional manager glanced nervously at his own phone, watching as the view count climbed higher with each passing minute. "Sir," the young flight attendant who had witnessed everything stepped forward. "Would you mind if I shared something?" When the businessman nodded encouragingly, she continued, "I've seen this kind of thing happen before, but I never knew what to do about it. I always felt horrible watching it happen." The businessman turned to address not just her, but all the airline staff who had gathered around. "That changes today. From now on, every employee of Summit Airways will have a voice. If you see something wrong, you'll have the power and the responsibility to speak up." The supervisor, who had been quietly processing the check-in, looked up. "I've worked here for 12 years, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought of myself as prejudiced. But today, watching myself through everyone else's eyes." She trailed off, unable to finish. "That's the first step," the businessman replied kindly. "Recognizing our biases is how we begin to overcome them." He turned to the board member who was still standing nearby. "I want to implement immediate changes. Every employee, from baggage handlers to board members, will go through new training." A cleaning staff member who had paused her work to watch spoke up from the edge of the crowd. "Will we be included too? Usually, we're left out of these things." Her question carried years of feeling invisible, of being overlooked. "Especially you," the businessman answered firmly. "Every person who wears a Summit Airways badge. Every person who helps our passengers in any way. You're all equally important to making this airline what it should be." The crowd had grown larger, with airport staff from other airlines now watching and listening. Something bigger than a simple check-in incident was unfolding. It was becoming a moment of transformation. Through the terminal windows, aircraft continued to take off and land, their rhythmic movement a reminder of the continuous flow of people from all walks of life who passed through these gates every day. Each plane carried hundreds of stories, hundreds of different lives connected by the simple act of travel. "You know," the elderly gentleman who had spoken up earlier said thoughtfully, "I've been flying for over 50 years. Times have changed, but some things haven't changed enough. What you're doing here, this is how real change happens." The businessman checked his watch. His flight would be boarding soon. "I want everyone to understand something," he said, raising his voice slightly so everyone could hear. "What happened here today wasn't just about one incident or two employees. It's about creating an airline where every passenger and every employee is treated with the same respect, regardless of how they look or what they're wearing." The supervisor's colleague, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. Will you help us learn how to do better?" Her voice was small but sincere. The businessman smiled warmly. "We'll learn together. Every mistake is an opportunity to improve, to become better than we were yesterday." He picked up his carry-on bag, ready to head to his gate. "Starting tomorrow, Summit Airways isn't just going to fly people to their destinations. We're going to help lift humanity a little higher." As he turned to leave, the crowd naturally parted to let him through. The young boy who had been watching everything tugged his father's sleeve one last time. "Dad," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "when I grow up, I want to be like him." The father smiled, speaking loud enough for the businessman to hear. "It's not about being like him, son. It's about being the best version of yourself and helping others do the same." Walking through the terminal toward his gate, the businessman could feel the atmosphere had changed. Word of what happened at the check-in counter had spread quickly. Airport staff who usually went about their duties barely noticing passengers were now looking up, some nodding respectfully as he passed by. Near one of the coffee shops, a group of flight attendants from various airlines were huddled together, discussing what they'd heard. One of them was describing how the video was already trending on social media. "It's going viral," she said to her colleagues. "People are calling it the airline lesson." The businessman paused at a newsstand, picking up a bottle of water. The shopkeeper, an older woman with kind eyes, refused to take his money. "My daughter works as a gate agent," she explained. "She's faced discrimination too, but from passengers. What you did back there, it's not just about airline staff learning. Passengers need to learn too." As he continued walking, a maintenance worker stopped buffing the floor to speak with him. "Sir," the worker said, his voice carrying years of wisdom, "I've been keeping these floors shining for 15 years, seen all kinds of people walk over them. First time I've seen someone turn a bad moment into a teaching moment like that." At the security checkpoint, the TSA agents were unusually attentive. One of them spoke quietly as he passed through. "My brother interviewed for a flight attendant position last month. Got turned down because they said he didn't fit the image. Maybe things will be different now." The moving walkway hummed beneath his feet as he made his way to his gate. A young woman caught up with him, slightly out of breath. She was wearing a backpack covered in travel stickers. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "I'm a student who saved up for a business class ticket to visit my sick grandmother. Last month, they made me feel like I didn't belong. Your actions today, they matter more than you know." Approaching his gate, he noticed the gate agents straightening their uniforms and adjusting their posture. The video had obviously reached them too. But instead of fear or nervousness, their faces showed something else. Hope, maybe even inspiration. A pilot and co-pilot walking past stopped to introduce themselves. The pilot, her captain's stripes gleaming, spoke with quiet determination. "Sir, I was one of only 3 female pilots when I started 20 years ago. What you're doing, changing the culture from the top, that's how real progress happens." At the gate area, passengers who had witnessed the earlier scene were sharing the story with others. An elderly couple was showing the viral video to a young family seated next to them. "See," the elderly man said to the children, "sometimes the most important lessons happen in the most unexpected places." The businessman settled into a seat near the window, watching as another Summit Airways plane taxied past. Its powerful engines gleamed in the sunlight, the company logo catching the light. That logo would soon stand for something different, something better. His phone buzzed with messages from board members and executives across the industry. The video had reached airline headquarters across the country. Some were already calling for industry-wide changes in training and policy. A gate agent approached him hesitantly. "Sir, we'll be boarding soon. Would you like to board first?" "No, thank you," he replied with a warm smile. "I'll board with my group, just like everyone else." The agent's face brightened with understanding. A young airport janitor pushing his cart nearby slowed down to listen. The businessman could see him taking out his phone, probably to share what he'd just heard with his coworkers. Small moments like these would help spread the message. True respect isn't about titles or positions. It's about recognizing the dignity in every person. As boarding time approached, the gate area had become unusually quiet. The typical rush and chaos of boarding had been replaced by something different, a sense of awareness, of people actually seeing each other. The gate agents, who had clearly heard about the check-in incident, were greeting each passenger with genuine warmth rather than rehearsed scripts. "Now boarding Group 1, the gate agent announced, her voice carrying a new kind of confidence. She made eye contact with each passenger as they approached, something passengers were noticing and appreciating. Several of them smiled back, creating small moments of real human connection. The businessman sat quietly, watching as priority passengers made their way through. A mother struggling with a baby stroller was immediately assisted by 2 flight attendants. "Please, let us help you," one of them said, and the businessman noticed it wasn't the practiced politeness he'd heard so often before. It was genuine. Through the gate windows, ground crew members were going about their work with the aircraft. One of them looked up and gave a quick wave when he noticed the businessman watching. Word had spread even to the tarmac staff, and somehow their movements seemed more purposeful now. "Group 2, you may now board," came the announcement. The businessman stood up, checking his boarding pass. A few passengers recognized him from earlier and nudged their companions. An older business traveler in an expensive suit stepped aside, gesturing for him to go ahead. "Please," the businessman said with a smile. "There's no need for special treatment. We're all just passengers here." This simple act drew appreciative looks from those nearby. A young professional woman in line behind him whispered to her colleague, "Now that's real leadership." As he walked down the jet bridge, he noticed small changes already taking place. The flight crew greeting passengers at the aircraft door had removed their usual plastic smiles. Instead, they showed genuine interest in each person who stepped aboard. They had heard about what happened, and they were already adapting. Inside the aircraft, a flight attendant was helping an elderly passenger store his bag in the overhead compartment. Another crew member was kneeling beside a nervous first-time flyer, patiently explaining safety procedures. These weren't new duties, but they were being performed with new spirit. Finding his seat in business class, the businessman noticed how the other passengers were interacting differently too. A woman in designer clothes offered to swap seats with a young man so he could sit next to his father. A businessman in a suit helped a student arrange her backpack in the overhead bin. The cabin crew did their pre-flight checks with extra attention. One flight attendant paused by his seat. "Sir," she said quietly, "what happened at check-in? It's already changing things. We had a quick crew meeting before boarding. Everyone's talking about making real changes, not just following scripts." Looking out the window, he could see the ground crew giving final signals. The sun had risen higher now, making the airport windows gleam. A baggage handler below looked up, caught his eye, and gave a thumbs up. Even here, at the most basic level of airline operations, people were feeling the impact of the morning's events. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but it wasn't the usual automated-sounding greeting. Instead, it was warm and personal. "Welcome aboard, everyone. We're not just here to fly you to your destination. We're here to make your journey comfortable and pleasant, each and every one of you." As the aircraft engines began their gentle whine, the businessman overheard a child asking her mother, "Mom, why is everyone being so nice today?" The mother's response carried clearly across the quiet cabin. "Because sometimes it takes just one person to remind everyone how we should treat each other." 1 month had passed since that memorable morning at the airport. The businessman sat in his office, looking through the reports from across the airline. The video of the check-in incident had reached millions of views, but more importantly, it had sparked real change throughout the industry. The supervisor and her colleague from that day were now leading the airline's new Dignity First training program. They shared their story openly, turning their mistake into a powerful lesson about unconscious bias. "We learned that true customer service starts with seeing the human being in front of you," the supervisor told a room full of new employees during training. The office walls were covered with letters from passengers and staff members alike. One letter stood out. It was from a young baggage handler. "Yesterday, a first-class passenger thanked me by name and asked about my day. Before your changes, most passengers wouldn't even look at us. Now, everyone from cleaning staff to pilots feels like we matter." The regional manager knocked on the door, carrying the latest customer satisfaction reports. "Sir, our numbers have gone up by 40% in just 1 month. But that's not the best part." He laid down several newspapers, each featuring stories about other airlines following Summit's lead in implementing similar training programs. Through his office window, he could see aircraft taking off and landing. Each plane now carried the airline's new slogan, "Rising Together." It wasn't just words, it was a promise being kept every day. The ground crew below wore new uniforms with name tags that read, "I'm here to help." Their idea, not management's. The young flight attendant who had spoken up that day was now heading the airline's new employee advocacy program. "We're not just changing policies," she explained in a company-wide memo. "We're changing hearts and minds. Every employee now knows they have the power to speak up when they see something wrong." His phone buzzed with a message. The elderly gentleman from that morning had posted another update. He had become something of a social media star, sharing his observations of the changes he saw during his frequent flights. "Flew Summit again today," his post read. "Watched a CEO give up his first-class seat for a student rushing home to see her sick mother. The spirit of change is catching on." The cleaning staff member who had asked if they would be included in training was now part of the airline's advisory board. "Every voice matters," she told her team. "From the person who cleans the toilets to the person who flies the plane. We're all essential to making this airline special." A knock at the door revealed the board member who had witnessed everything that day. "The other airlines want to know our secret," she said with a smile. "I told them it's simple. We just started treating everyone, employees and passengers alike, the way they deserve to be treated all along." The businessman stood up and walked to the window. Below, he could see the two check-in staff members from that day greeting an elderly couple in traditional clothing with genuine warmth. No fake smiles, no judgments, just real human connection. His phone dinged again. Another message from an airline CEO. "What you started is changing the entire industry. Our board just approved a similar program." The ripples of that morning are becoming waves of change. Looking at his desk calendar, he smiled at the note for next week. First industry-wide Dignity in Aviation Conference. Representatives from airlines worldwide would be attending, all because of one morning when bias was confronted with kindness and punishment was replaced with education. The last light of the day streamed through his office window, catching the frame of a new photo on his wall. It showed him as a young baggage handler, standing proudly on the tarmac. Below it, a simple quote read, "Every person carries a story. Our job is not just to carry their bags or their bodies, but their dignity too."